Thank you everybody for coming out on a wet Welsh evening to hear somebody whose name might have been rather distant to you, and I'm afraid the economics that I'm going to talk about are going to be poorly formed. It reminds me actually of, I used to serve an ambassador in Washington called Sir Peter Ramsbottom, who was the nicest of men and desperately needed even my inexperienced help when he travelled around the country, leaving his bag all over the place and getting to the wrong station and all the rest of it. He was once speaking at an event in Albuquerque, which those of you who were watching Breaking Bad will know pretty well. And it was lunchtime, but the chairman of the local Rotary Club, or whatever it was, had already had quite a good lunch, I think. And he wasn't quite clear who was coming, but he did finally grasp that it was the British ambassador. So he said with great verve and aplomb, and now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to welcome the British ambassador, Lord Rockbottom. So here you have Alan Winespan talking to you about all sorts of things this evening, but particularly geopolitics, which I sort of specialise in because I decided in my late career, I haven't retired yet, I'm afraid, to specialise in the big picture. And why I want to talk to you this evening about the big picture is because as small human beings, each of you, you live in that big picture, and in business you are affected by that big picture. And I want to describe the relationship, as I see it, between geopolitics, which I will define as the distribution of power globally. Politics is about power, and geopolitics is about global power and its individual components. And why geopolitics affect business is for an absolutely fundamental and basic reason, is that politics affects everything. And if you try and do your business locally, fine, if you understand local politics and whose hand you need to hold in yours locally, or I suppose whose hand you need to grease locally, whatever is necessary. In national politics, you need to do the same, and you're familiar with that, but less familiar than with your local politics. But if you have an international business or a business that depends on international happenings or economic growth or trading arrangements or raw materials, and I dare say there may be 1, 2, or 3 businesses represented in this hall this evening that is not on that list, but the rest are, you will need to understand geopolitics for a very good reason, that the world is changing. Cliché. The world is changing faster than institutions can reform themselves. A bit more interesting. The world is changing to a degree where no business with international interests or spread can afford not to calculate and assess the external risk that comes to their bottom line from changing geopolitics. It matters whether you pay attention to it or not. And that's why I hope that in this opportunity I have to hear your views this evening and to give you mine this evening, I can give you a subjective view of what's happening in geopolitics. Globalization you're familiar with. And from the way it's talked about, you would think it affected everything. Well, of course it does, but not everything is globalized. Economics, exchange, the movement of capital, labour, goods, services is globalized. Trade arrangements are globalized. The UN, incidentally, is very important in that arrangement and taken for granted. Information is globalized. You are all on the web in one form or another, or close to somebody who is. Information is hugely available to you. You only have to press a couple of switches to get to any source of information that is not classified, and probably to some that are, because leaks are quite useful nowadays, and I'm not in government any longer. But you have to judge the quality of that information. The quantity of it is available to you. Those things are globalized. All forms of communication, travel, at least to places that are safe, across borders that no longer hold you up, is familiar to you. But what is not globalized, the counterforce to that spreading out of economic activity and the sharing of information, is something very important. It's basically politics. Politics in this era, the era of your business arrangements, your business success now, politics is polarizing for very particular reasons and predictable reasons, although it's not often discussed in the way that I'm talking to you about it this evening. Politics is polarizing because identity is polarizing, and the two things are very closely connected. And they come from something that is a great global common good that you all now take for granted, but like oxygen, has its downsides. Oxygen allows you to breathe, burns the fuel in your body, and makes us animate on this planet, but it also, of course, eventually kills you because free radicals degrade our bodies and they come out of oxygen. In the same way, freedom has its downsides. A world that is freer is more open to you for the opportunities in your personal and community lives to do the things that you want to do. But if everybody is freer, there is a downside. And the downside is in the balance between freedom and order. And that balance is getting out of kilter in the international system at this moment. And in a freer world, we have a stronger and more present freedom of choice to do exactly what we want, so long as generally we're within the law. And that means that we do what comes most naturally to us, because that is the strongest desire in our psychological makeup. So what is the free, normal, default setting of the human being? The animal that only a very small number of million years ago, maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, the animal that learnt something about controlling its environment to become the dominant species on the planet. What were the characteristics that made that animal the dominant species? Overcoming, being superior to, and now beginning to destroy many other species of animal. They were threefold: intelligence, obviously, adaptability, very important because the climate was always changing and the environment was always changing for mobile animals like the early humans, beginning in Africa. And thirdly, very important, absolutely necessary, teamwork. Because we as an animal are not the strongest or the largest or the ones with sharpest teeth or fleetest foot or greatest poisonous strike. We are a middle-ranking, middle-power animal with those three characteristics: intelligence, adaptability, and teamwork. And we organize ourselves with that teamwork in a very particular way. We are both literally and metaphorically tribal. The default setting for the human being is tribal. That is, we live and work and feel most comfortable with people of our own identity, whom we can do things with as part of that teamwork that allows us to control our environment. No other animal is able to do that. And that freedom that you have, that the world has, except in corners of distress and war and low development, which are not minuscule, they need to be treated, but they're not you, that freedom actually narrows your horizon to paying less attention to the things that in another era, under different circumstances, you might fear, like the invasion from another big power, or collapsing economies because raw materials are not available, or maybe looking into the future, a changing climate because we have been careless about our emissions of carbon. The fear surrounding that has not yet reached a great enough level for us to do anything serious about it. Your default setting in a free environment is tribal, and therefore politics becomes more identity bound because that is the way that it goes. Our horizons are narrowing across the world, and that feeds into geopolitics, where increasingly, as under the aegis of the United States above all, we have created a free and open and meritocratic and egalitarian structure in global interaction, a multiplicity of decision-making centres has come out of that freedom. This makes the institutional life of the intergovernmental side of the United Nations very difficult, and it makes the relationships between powers, big and small, immensely complex because of that equal multiplicity of decision-making centres. It's illustrated easily in the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is the controlling body of the UN, but a chaotic system for a very good business-like reason that all of you will easily understand, that a committee of 193 is not a very effective body. A committee of 10 is not a very effective body. A committee of anything more than 8, in my experience, always needs a subcommittee, a core, a manipulator or a team of 2 or 3 manipulators actually to get things done. So how on earth can a committee at the UN of 193 get anything done? Good question, rhetorical. Nothing much gets done in the General Assembly except rhetoric. But the Security Council is something else. And the Security Council is more than 8 and therefore has a core of people there to manipulate the politics of it, who are normally referred to as the permanent 5. Actually, outside your expectations, they don't often caucus together that much. They don't fix things. They respect the elected members of the Security Council. But they do have a huge privilege, which is permanent presence in the Security Council, which means quite a lot. Those 5 are the powers who in the end have the greatest say in an increasingly free world on whether it's going to be a stable and peaceful world or a conflictual one. Now, from all that description, and I want to get into a conversation about this and hear what you think about it, something is beginning to happen that is actually quite worrying. The Arab Spring, the Middle East, what's happening in Syria, what has happened and is still happening in Libya and in North Africa and in Yemen and in parts of Africa and 1 or 2 other places in other continents, is very worrying. Local conflict has become more prevalent because of the freedom and the tribal instinct that I've been talking about. And the UN is less able to deal with conflicts within nations because it's not in the UN Charter to do that. It's an international organization, not an interfering organization in sovereign states. So there's an organizational problem there, which leads to difficulties about something happening in Syria or in Libya or in Iraq, which we've taken slightly different decisions on as a government at different times in different places. But the politics of that are part of the bad weather that's there in the world. What worries me more than that is the situation in Russia and Ukraine, because for the first time since the end of the Cold War, two or more big powers are coming into conflict with each other over territory, over something that really matters to both of them, and are increasingly less using the talking instruments of the United Nations to resolve it. Angela Merkel has spoken some 50 times to President Putin about Ukraine since the saga started a year or more ago, and they know each other pretty well and speak each other's languages. She is the most likely Western leader to get through to Putin. I understand, and it's been talked about in the press, that in the last few of those conversations, she is increasingly despairing that she can get through to Putin, whom she knows and can speak to pretty easily, because there's something in his mind which she can't get through to, and he thinks there's something in her mind that he can't get through to. And that habit of talking within the UN framework or coached by the UN habit is not working over Russia and Ukraine. This crisis is escalating because the Russians are telling lies about what they're doing in Ukraine, and because the Russians feel the West has told them lies, partly true, about the expansion of NATO and the interests of Europe and the rest of the West in Eastern Europe and in the former territories of the Soviet Union. Something has gone badly wrong in that relationship, and for the first time, as I say, since 1990, and certainly since my experience in the Security Council, two of the permanent members are using language with each other that is both partially mendacious and threatening in terms of conflict. This is dangerous. And big power confrontation is the one thing we desperately have to avoid, because all other long periods of peace in history have, by definition, ended with war, and war, though horrible, is a cleansing mechanism and something we learn from. The Congress of Vienna, well, the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century was one set of treaty arrangements that got the powers living together in a balance. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 sorted out Europe post the Napoleonic Wars for virtually 100 years of peace with one or two blips in it, like the War of 1870, etc., like the revolutions of 1848, but on the whole, 100 years of peace, and then broke down. The League of Nations was actually rather a poor attempt, because the Americans would not join it in any active sense, to form a collective global look at the sustaining of peace. And it wasn't until what an American called Strobe Talbot has called the Great Experiment with the United Nations came in 1945, that we have had so sophisticated a system for keeping global peace that has lasted with active mechanisms for 70 years and promises to last for longer. But once the big powers in that organization stop talking to each other and have trouble with each other, then even the clever mechanisms of the United Nations are not sufficient to keep us in peace unless we do other things. Now, lots of things can stem from that argument. You are a business audience. I am conscious of the effect of geopolitics going wrong on the global economy and on economic exchange above all, because in the 21st century, when the overweening power of politics and diplomacy and the military have been proved to go wrong so often from the colonial era onwards, the characteristic of greatest impact in 21st century power and in this era is economic. It's economic performance that defines the capacity of a country and its impact. And what you supply to economies, both our own in this country and to the others you trade with, are an absolutely essential part of global peace and of the understanding of mutual interest on this planet. But if politics, which in its potential is, as it were, senior to, is overbearing on economics when it goes wrong, if politics goes wrong, your arrangements for the economic and commercial world will go wrong with it. So what do we do about that? Are our political leaderships going to be big enough to face up to it? I hope so. But President Obama is not talking to President Putin. Something has gone wrong in that relationship. President Obama isn't even talking to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So how can he be talking really sensibly and intelligently to either President Xi or President Putin? I think the American relationship with China is something other than the relationship with Russia. But with Russia, it's gone wrong. America is not talking like it used to talk to other powers. There is something internal happening in the United States, which a little bit is being echoed in the polarizing politics of our own nation, which is quite disturbing. The message out of that, to conclude this part of the evening, is actually quite important. For businesses, as the world changes and as the institutions that you're familiar with that give you the framework for that commercial and economic exchange weaken, because they always do in a long period of peace, they don't reform themselves as quick as the world changes for very understandable reasons. As those institutions begin to be less effective in your interests, what conclusions do you draw from that? You have to be more self-sufficient. You have to be more adaptable. You have to be more responsible for your own affairs, because that is the balance to freedom. That is something you have to give back for what the world has given you in terms of circumstance and prosperity and freedom of choice. And if you transfer that from business, because I think that self-sufficiency, adaptability, contingency planning, and other assessments of risk are very important for today's businesses. If you take that into your personal lives and your political lives in society, it is also true that if governments are weaker because you are freer and stronger as individuals, you have to be governed. You can't have a teamwork society without the macroeconomy, macro defense, infrastructure, other big picture things being handled by. You have to give room to governments to govern. Now, I'm not standing here in front of you this evening to speak up for politicians, but I've watched politicians struggle with the raw deal they're getting from the complexity of interacting affairs in an interdependent world. It's too much for them and their structures. And secondly, from the increasingly diminishing respect that they're getting from their electorate, because they do make mistakes, because they're human. And if you need them, and if you need order, you've got to plough something back in the negotiation of human affairs into the preservation of your freedom. There is a balance between freedom and order, freedom and responsibility. And as individuals with greater strength and power, then your ancestors, you're going to have to contribute something to that. I said exactly the same at 2 o'clock to the schools that I met in Cardiff, in Barry, talking about the model UN issues that they had in front of them as school children representatives of Brazil and Ethiopia and Iraq and other countries around the Security Council. Or the economic. At 4 o'clock I was talking to the university about the way the world is going. Very intelligent questions coming out of the International Relations faculty at Cardiff University. And I'm talking to you of a different generation from those two, but in exactly the same way that in your lives you have to understand what you need to plough back to preserve the bases of economic exchange, commercial activity, political stability and peace in the world around you. It's not going to be done for you only by governments in a freer 21st century world. There are huge opportunities out there, all sorts of things going right. Technology on the whole, in my mind, is progress, is going in the right direction. The capacity of younger people to understand their own society, their level, is improving, is growing, is better than it was at my age in my time. They are coping. But somewhere from all of you collectively and everybody else has to come an investment in maintaining, preserving, or reforming the institutions that give you the certainty or the close to certainty that you can do business in a stable world. It is not going to be there naturally from the trends that I'm describing. I'd be glad to be challenged on that, but I would like you to think about it. Thank you very much.